First up is the latest iteration of Wolfman, this time coming from director Leigh Whannell, and I will be very upfront, I always am. I am not the intended audience for this film because I don't like scary movies. I don't like them because I don't like being scared. I suppose I have a very active imagination, and so I get really affected by this type of film, and I don't sleep, and I don't enjoy that experience. So in that sense, I'm sure I'm some directors' dream audiences because they want to terrorize people, but I am going to start off by saying, in that regard, I am not the person who wants to see this film. Now, can I analyze this film and, understand this film from an objective perspective? Absolutely. So that's what we're going to look at it from. Now, part of the reason I was willing to see this, because there are a lot of scary and horror movies that I just will not go see because I know it will be too much for me, is this is another one of the Universal movie monsters kind of remakes, and I did see Leigh Whannell's version of Invisible Man, and I actually really respected and appreciated what he was doing with it, so I was like, cool, I will give this a try. The only other film of his I've seen is Upgrade, and I did not realize until a friend told me that this is the person who brought us Saw, and I'm like, oh, seeing Wolfman, I now understand that more. So Wolfman, while technically kind of licensed out from the Universal movie monsters, canon of characters, I think much like Invisible Man, this is sort of a different take on it, and I don't think it's as successful in a lot of regards. This version of it stars Christopher Abbott and Julia Garner as a couple who go into the woods with their young daughter, played by Matilda Firth. And, there's a lore in the woods about basically werewolves, and I think they simultaneously try to modernize it, but also ground it in a different type of, indigenous lore, but they don't talk a ton about that. And so, and this is from the very get-go, you get a text explanation of the lore of the werewolves. And I'm like, okay, I get that it can sometimes be cheesy to, have a character have to explain that, but this is how we're starting off, so I'm not really spoiling anything. From there, we get your classic terrifying trope of creature in the woods, no power, middle of nowhere, nobody else to hear you scream, etc., etc., etc. I was not expecting as much body horror in this as I got. I did get like an email blast from them that had a very gross image in it, so I actually probably should have known going into it, but I'm going to warn you now, because obviously there's a spectrum of horror fans, that this is a lot more body horror than I think folks might be expecting. So if that is something you are averse to, be aware of that and maybe consider not going. Now, again, I'm usually willing to see these sort of ones that are based on classic stories because I know generally where we're going with it. Like a Dracula film I can usually handle because I'm like, I know where you're going with it. Like I know how a vampire functions. A werewolf, very similar. There are definitely a lot of homages in this to the Lon Chaney 1941 film. You can tell they clearly respect it, but that's about as far as we kind of get. I just think plot-wise and like character development-wise, I know what they're going for with a lot of it. A lot of it's like family-related, and there's stuff about generational trauma, and I see what they're trying to accomplish with it, but I don't think they are nearly as successful as something, again, I keep comparing them, I know, but it is just so similar in terms of what I think, while Invisible Man is elevated and the horrors of power and, relationship dynamics and stuff like that, like Wolfman is just more of the same, and it simultaneously overcomplicates itself but doesn't add enough dimension in it to make it worth it. So I don't think it's quite as successful. Are there moments where I jumped out of my seat? Absolutely, because I am just prone to react like that to any sort of like loud noises or, jump scares or things like that. So it does accomplish what it sets out to do in some of those senses, but it feels like it is relying upon very base instinct things versus actually trying to create a sense of terror and horror and emotional investment in it. This is very primal in some senses. I get it. It's Wolfman. But having seen that he can do this with other films, I'm like, oh, I really wish you had applied that to this. I think it's a very simplistic story. And if you are thinking about going to the theater to just turn your brain off and you like this type of film, I think it's fine. If you are expecting something more out of him, which I honestly was, then I think you're going to be a little disappointed by this one. Again, I think the effects are fine. It's a very contained film also in many senses, which in a lot of horror films, I actually think that could be really successful, right? Where you're like, oh, you either feel a sense of claustrophobia or, there's a sense of loneliness or isolation. But this one, I'm just like, I feel like you were just limited on your budget. I'm not knocking that, but I think there are plenty of directors who've shown ways to do things with a limited budget, with a limited scope of available, setting and all that stuff that have done it more successfully. So I'm just like, this was kind of a bummer in that senses. And it also didn't scare me so much that I couldn't sleep. But again, maybe because it's just a story, werewolf story, and I'm familiar with it. But so it's not even like super scary or makes you think beyond anything. So I'm just like, this is just a film that I saw. I'm not saying it's the worst thing I've seen. I can see that they were trying. I just don't think they succeeded. So if you are like me and do not particularly enjoy horror films for any sort of reason, this is definitely not for you. If you are a huge fan of Leigh Whannell and, you saw Invisible Man, you're like, this is really elevated and great, very much temper your expectations for this. If you are just like a general horror fan or a Universal Movie Monster fan or any of those things, I just think, like, I'm not encouraging you to go see this movie. I don't know if I'm the right person to say, like, absolutely not. But if you are anybody who falls outside of the super fan category, I'm going to go ahead and say you can probably skip this one or maybe wait till it is available at home, which I know does kind of take away some of the scary of, the dark theater and the distractions, all that stuff. But end of the day, I am only going to give Wolfman a 2.6 out of 5. The next film I have is called September 5, and this is based off the 1972 Munich Olympics, where there was a hostage crisis with Israeli athletes, and this is about the broadcasting team, and it was American sports broadcasters who ended up covering this as opposed to, like classic news folks doing it. Now, I will add the context of I saw this film. I mean, obviously, this is a recent announcement, but that there was, we just thankfully had an announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine, which, hooray, lots of progress to still be made there, and people need to actually hold up their sides of the bargains, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I saw this before that announcement, and so this was a really heavy film in many senses for me to see because it was just frustrating to think, like, the state of the world has not made much progress, and, it's depressing that we have become desensitized, or like this is, commonplace versus in 1972 where this is, such a wild event that was happening. And there was just a lot of, real world context happening that may have adjusted my viewing experience of this film. Now, do I think that's all still pretty applicable, honestly, going forward, even if you were to see this today or a week from today or a year from today? I think some of my feedback still stands. So my biggest thing about this, and maybe this is just because of who I am as an audience member, because I have worked in media and I've never worked in live television, but I've worked live broadcast type events. And so it felt very inside baseball to me. And the cast in this is pretty stacked. It's got Peter Sarsgaard, it's got John Magaro, it's got Leonie Benesch, Marcus Rutherford. And I think part of the challenge of, especially when somebody involved in a creative medium and media is making a film about media, is you can get a little bit of blinders on. And I did not feel the emotional stakes, I think, of the whole situation that was going on. And I didn't also feel the emotional stakes for the characters that were going on. Because I do think you can tell the story through the lens of these sports broadcasters who are very like, we got to get the shot, and can we show this, and do we have a live feed? And, nobody had ever dealt with a situation like this unraveling in real time in a live broadcast scenario. Sadly, like I said, now this is just kind of commonplace. But I think the challenge with this is that it got really focused on the technical parts of it. How are they technically going to pull this off versus emotionally the, for lack of a better word, trauma and stress and all that stuff. And, the ethics of all of it. Like, that was just kind of missing for me, and at best was in the background. And I think that needed to be much more prominent in order to make this film a really excellent film. It's a solid film. It's well constructed. You feel the semi-real-time nature of it. I think they also kind of actually did themselves a disservice in trying to be very faithful to the actual broadcast that happened and all that stuff. Like, I think they just got in their own way sometimes in a way that I was like, oh, this could have been really great, but it's solid. For me, I was also approaching it from like, cool, so you're not taking me on a personalized journey or an emotional journey. I'm just having to ingest more trauma from the world that was, however many years ago, how many decades ago, but it's still trauma that's persisting, and you're not giving an original spin to it. Therefore, like, why am I even watching this? So I also may have suffered from people overhyping it. That's definitely possible. I found it to be fine. It's solid. I know it's gotten a lot of awards buzz, and I'm just kind of like, really? And maybe that's just because the year we're in. It's a semi-odd year in terms of content. But like I said, I think it's a well-crafted film from a technical perspective. And I do think some of the performances are pretty strong. Like, I have to give credit to Leonie Benesch. She is, I think, the glue of this film, actually. But In terms of how I would like to see a world event like this approached, and I think they have the framework for it, I think they are just missing the heart for a story like this. So I'm only going to give this a 3.6 out of 5. If you feel strongly about going to see this film, I think you will respect and enjoy it. But if you were on the fence, like, I am not particularly pushing for this. 3.6 out of 5 for September 5 for me.